Today we continue our series on the Apostles' Creed, and you'll see it on the screen. Each week we read it aloud, and just like the kids were learning, repetition and saying things out loud helps you. And so I invite you to actually read aloud with me the Apostles' Creed, which you'll see on the screen. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. On the third day, he rose again from the dead. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. Shall give the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. Amen. So this everyone knows that one. You know, if you were growing up in the 1950s, everyone had John 3:16 memorized. Do ye be judged? You almost know that one. Old high schools, they know do not judge way more than they know John 3:16. That's like a part of common culture now. And that goes to a time in our church's history where we needed to recapture that phrase, do not judge, in a new way. So if you were growing up in the 1950s in the United States and you went to church, you know, everyone dressed all proper, and when you came to church, a lot of Christianity was related to your behavior. And so you knew you were a good Christian if you acted a certain way. You know what I mean? You didn't drink too much. In fact, if you were buying alcohol in the grocery store, you made sure you covered it up with other groceries so that no one saw it, right? Or you weren't supposed to smoke, or you weren't supposed to do this, and you didn't dance. And so Christianity in the mid-20th century was often reduced to a lot of behavior. And so then there was like this hippie movement that came, where are my baby boomers at? Who said, you know, but we want to go to, they like are afraid to raise their hand. You know, because they don't want to be judged. And they said, you know, we don't want to live in a culture or go to church in a place where you're going to be judged all the time based on your behavior. And so we want to like make church more a relationship with God where you're more free to be yourself. And so there was all kinds of movements at the latter end of the 20th century that still influence us today, where you don't want to talk about judging in church. And so we want a God that doesn't judge us, but a God that just loves us. And so there was a big shift away from judgment. God is both, but you can't focus at a time. Also coupled with a big cultural movement that was going on at the same time called postmodernism. And most people phrase postmodernism and what it means. But fundamentally at the root, what it was this idea that you and I, there is no such thing as truth, or no such thing as ultimate truth, but you get to decide what's true for you, and I get to decide what's true for me. And I can live my life the way I want to, and you can live your life the way you want to. Just don't judge me, and I'll try not to judge you. And so we grew up in this culture where we didn't like the idea of a judge, and we didn't like the idea of judging. And so what we're all going to do is just get rid of judging, and there's no judge. We don't even want to talk about God and judge about God and Judgment Day. That's all bad stuff. Whew, that's not popular. Let's get rid of that. And instead, let's just live our lives the way we want. So that's kind of like what we tried to do. Now, the irony of that is that's gone kind of well. You know, kids, when they're growing up in schools, they learn all about empathy and being kind and nice. Like on the wall of my kids' school, you know, it has all these great things about how they get to be themselves and do great things. It never says, hey, get in line or follow the rules. Like, that's just not the vibe. The irony and the great paradox of a culture that does not judge or does not want to judge is we possibly live right now in one of the judgiest judging cultures in the history of the world. Let me give you a few examples. Have you ever heard of cancel culture? Where if you say something wrong or do something wrong for the rest of your life, everyone's going to remember it and then shame you if you do it wrong. And so you have to be very careful how you curate your digital portfolio and your online social media. Because if you do something wrong, everyone will tell you. In fact, there's the post, but if you look underneath the post, what's there? About 500 judges. Judges deciding whether or not your post was good or not. And so we like it or we don't like it. Then there's not just the cancel culture and the online shaming, but there's this massive rise nowadays of social credit scores, where if I want to know what a good restaurant is, I just look at their Yelp reviews. In fact, I can know whether or not something's good or bad by just checking what everyone else says about it. I know when I'm having a bad time somewhere that I can truly be the judge of the world. And when I go on a Yelp review, I tell people what I really think, you know. Like, if I'm grumpy, I can just create a permanent record of my grumpiness so that the rest of the world even knows. This is a true story. I stayed at a hotel one time that was so bad that, I just felt like, you know what, I'm going to let everyone know how bad this hotel is. And actually, to this day, I still get all kinds of emails letting me know how great my review was and that it really helped them make a decision. And that just encourages me. Man, judging is fun. I'm really good at it. Other people judge my judging and tell me I'm good at judging, and I'm just going to keep this going. We live in a very judgy culture. But you know, it's not that easy, and it is exhausting. Because I know as a parent, one of the things that's hard for me is I'm judged based on how well my kids do. And then I'm terrified for them because every once in a while we get this thing called state testing scores, right? And it's where we judge our kids to decide whether or not they're good at something or bad at something. My kids are still in elementary school, but now we have competitive sports that start when they're this high, and they have to go to tryouts when they're just years old. They're getting judged from the time that they're born whether they're going to be good enough to be able to do something. It's a tough process, and I don't know about you. I'm even judged by my dogs. When my dogs run out and bark at someone in our front yard, I just feel shame. And I'm like, could you just represent me better? Everyone's judging me. And of course, they don't speak English. That doesn't help. Anyway, it's a tough world. And I don't know about you, but when you got up this morning, you thought to yourself, what should I wear? And you didn't make a decision based on what you should wear, based on what felt good. You make it a decision based on what you think people would like and think would look good on you. Not so that you approve of it, but because you know there's judges everywhere that you go. So we live ironically in a culture that doesn't like judging and definitely doesn't want a God who judges, but has created about 1 billion micro-judges that are judging you and yourself all the time. It's an exhausting wheel that we can never get off of. And one of the reasons why we often ignore this idea of God as judge is because we just don't want another judge in our life right now. I judge myself. I'm judged by everyone others. I'm judged by people at work. I'm judged by all my neighbors. I'm judged by... it's exhausting. Is there a way out of it, and is there a solution? I think there is, and that's what we want to talk about today. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 3, the Apostle Paul writes something that's powerful. He says, "But with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself." The Apostle Paul, if you can remember anything about him, was the ultimate judger. He was a Pharisee. And in fact, Jesus was a judger, a little bit. And the people that he judged the most were the judgers. The Pharisees were the people that looked at people and said, you're good enough or you're bad enough. You've made it or you haven't made it. They were really good at looking at the outside of things and determining what was good and bad. And Jesus goes, I don't like that. And the Apostle Paul was the top Pharisee of Pharisees. And so he had passed every test. He had gotten to the top where people looked at him as the judge of judges. And here, after he meets Jesus, he says something astounding. He says, it's a very small thing to me now that I should be judged at all or by anyone else, by any human court. I do not even judge myself. The Apostles' Creed in this phrase is an alternative to a judging world, but it gets there in a very unique way. It doesn't do it by avoiding judgment. It does it by getting rid of certain forms of judgment that don't matter, and that when we meet the judge who actually does have the power to judge, we encounter something we don't expect. Today I want to talk about that phrase, he's kind of going to come to judge the living and the dead. So we're going to focus first on the living and then on the dead. You're in the living category, most of you. So this first one will apply to you. The second one applies mainly to our cemeteries, but that matters because you and I will be there too one day. First, let's focus on what it means that God judges the living. Have you ever heard the quick and the dead? Quick is just an old school English way of referring to the living. It means you can still move. But what does it mean when God says he's going to judge the living? 2 Corinthians 5:10, the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what is done in the body. In Hebrews 4 it says, and no creature is hidden from God's sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. So it's unmistakable and undebatable that God will judge and sees everything. And how does that make you feel? I'll tell you how it makes me feel. Terrible. You know, often we think of the judgment as like a courtroom scene, right? Where there's like someone on trial and you're being tried and you're found guilty and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes the Bible uses that language, but there's other language that I actually prefer about judgment that are more clear. And here we have it in Hebrews chapter 4. It's where it says, no creature is hidden from God's sight. When I think of God's judgment of me and of you, this is what I think of. I had an MRI done on my shoulder last month because I'm really bad at golf, and one day I wanted to be less terrible at it. And I'm like, you know what? It can't be my swing. It must be my body. I got to fix it. It's my shoulder. You know, so I had an MRI done. It turns out I've got a floating piece of bone in there I'll deal with. But what was amazing to me about it is you know, you go in this machine, and what it does is it has an ability that's like magic where it looks inside your body and it can see what's going on in there. When God judges us, what he does is he's not a God of dermatology. Dermatology just looks at the outside stuff and can tell you what's going on. But what God does is instead of just kind of judging you with a gavel and deciding you're guilty, what he's going to do to you and I one day is he's just going to hold up a mirror to you and I. And there's almost nothing more terrifying than a mirror. You know, my wife used to make fun of me when we first got married because she noticed something about me. She noticed that whenever I looked at myself in a mirror, I had a face. Where I would be like, you know, like Zoolander. Where like I would just make sure that I look good in the mirror, right? You know, like you almost stand a certain way when you look in the mirror. Why? Because you want to look good. But God has a special mirror where he points it at you and I. And it's where we're able to see ourselves as we truly are, in a way that we're almost afraid to see. If God pointed a mirror at me and stood there behind it, and I got to actually see myself as I truly am, I'll just confess to you, in general terms, that would be the worst day of my life. I'd see good things. You know, I often think of how when I think of God the most is usually when I'm doing good things. I'm like, man, God, did you see what I just did? I'm so awesome. Did you capture that? But one of the reasons why God always connects, Jesus especially connected sin to darkness, is because there's parts of me that I'm embarrassed about. There's things that I've thought or said or done that I'm ashamed about. And whenever I think of myself and who I am, I definitely don't put that stuff on Facebook. And I definitely don't want a mirror pointed at me where I have to look at those things and see them. I only like to see myself as I'd like to be, not as who I really am. Judgment isn't like God coming down and be like, you're bad. It's actually just revealing what's already there. And what's already there is a mixture of crazy things. I'm sure this is true for you because I know it's true for me, which is if God just let me look at myself in a mirror, I'd be like, man, I am more mysteriously and beautifully made than I could ever imagine, and I am created in the image of God, and there's sacredness to me that is like more astounding and beautiful, and he's gifted me with spiritual gifts that I like don't even realize the potential of. And at the same time, there's parts of Chris that terrify me. And my sin ensnares me to the bone to the point where I'm ashamed and embarrassed, where if a mirror was held up to me, I wouldn't know what to do. I'd be terrified. God's judgment is the moment, not where he comes and says you're good or bad. It's where he just says, this is you. Isaiah was once caught up in the prophet from the Old Testament, was once caught up into heaven. And when he goes to heaven, he like sits in the powerful presence of God and has this vision of God on his throne. And the first words out of his mouth were what? No, I don't belong here. God, you're so good. Woe is me. I'm a man of unclean lips. I come from a people of unclean lips. Those are the words that he said, which in other words is saying, I don't want this mirror. I don't want to be here. This is too uncomfortable. And one of the reasons why we don't talk about judgment is because it's uncomfortable. And so I walk around most of my life with like a mask that I wear called Pastor Chris or Chris Atwood or a dad or whatever it is, where I walk around with a mask because I only want people to see the parts of me that I'm ready and able to reveal to other people. I like to put the best version of myself first because I'm terrified that if most people actually knew all of me, they wouldn't like any of me. Because we live in a world that's full of judgment. And we live in a world where I'm terrified that if people actually knew, they wouldn't like. The Apostle Paul said, but with me, it's a very small thing that I should be judged by you. And I know that if I confess how I really feel, it really matters to me what people think of me. And it really matters how am I standing among things. And so it's uncomfortable for me to deal with judgment. We're going to talk about how God answers that in a minute. But for those of us that are living, judgment is hard. One of the things about the judgment of the dead that's interesting is that for most people who are dead, judgment is a good thing. In Acts 10:42, it says this, and he, Jesus, commanded us, this was Peter talking, Jesus commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one appointed by God to be the judge of the living and the dead. So the Apostles' Creed actually comes from Scripture there. And in Revelation it says in chapter 20, I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne for judgment. And so we know there's going to be a judgment both now, I feel it, and in the future when I come back. For those of us that are alive today, we experience judgment as fear. That God would love me as I really am. Is it really possible? If my classmates knew me as I really am. If my parents knew me as I really am. For a lot of folks who have died, you should know that they look forward to God's judgment more than you can ever imagine. If you were murdered by someone or killed in war by an unjust oppressor, the final story on your life, if God doesn't come back, is evil won. Evil wins. Most of history is just powerful people coming in and deciding what they want done. And for most of the story of humanity, it's about people getting beat up by other people and about sin actually ruling the day, where bombs and missiles and murder and gossip and shame and all the sin that we bring ends up being the last word in our story. And eventually death. The reason why judgment is often a hopeful thing is because for anyone that's suffered persecution or death, it's the one time that God will actually come to set things right. For the early Christians, the book of, for you and I read Revelation and we're like, this is weird. I don't understand how any of this works. It's apocalyptic literature. It's not meant to be read literally most of the time. But the reason why the early Christians loved it, and it was one of their favorite books in the Bible perhaps, outside of the Gospels and other things, was because they were being persecuted. They were being beat up. If they walked around and told people that Jesus was Lord, the government in those days said, well, I hate to break it to you, but I'm your Lord, and here's a whip. And so the early Christians, when they read that God was going to come and judge the world, they thought to themselves, thank God you're coming. Because this world is too heavy for me to carry, and there's so much pain in it. And I've been beat up and spit on and defeated all over the place. So judgment, to many who have died, is going to not just be like a painful thing. For many who have died in the past and God comes back to judge, it'll be the one day things are finally fixed. And where God will finally say, I was right and they were wrong. And so you have to understand that for those of us that are very comfortable living in the West, we live in a day and age where whatever war is, we're the ones just pushing buttons. But there are actually people under whom missiles fall. And they wonder that one day God will come and actually set things right. And I'm not making a judgment on who's right or wrong, but trust me when I say there are a lot of people, Christians included, that beg for the judgment of God to come so that things can finally be fixed. Miroslav Volf, who's a Yale theologian and a Christian, grew up in a society in Eastern Europe where there was incredible persecution when he was growing up. And so there were neighboring towns and ethnic groups in what's now Croatia where they would actually come in and murder another group of people that were from a different ethnic class. So in his childhood memories, and he's a Christian today, but when he was growing up, he tells stories of where another neighboring village who was of one ethnicity would walk into another ethnicity neighborhood, and they would actually come in with guns and with knives and murder and cut and enslave people from another village. That doesn't happen very often in Olentangy School District, but there are parts of the world where this regularly happens. In my own lifetime, it's happened with Hutsis and Tutsis, and it happens all over the world. But when he was growing up in a household that experienced extraordinary violence, where he saw his own neighbors killed, he grew up and became a Christian. And if I grew up and I saw people that were killed and hurt that way, my default result would be, I don't believe in God. How could I believe in God? How could a good God let something like this happen? And if you're a thinking person, you may have thought that too. Why did he become a Christian even though he saw terrible acts of violence and injustice? The reason why the judgment of God matters to him and why it helps is because if there isn't a God who judges, then whatever happens is the way that things are supposed to be, and nothing good will ever come of it. And so if someone is terribly abused, or if you're murdered, or if something terrible happens, and there's no God who's going to come and judge things, then the only answer to the way the world works today is, well, that's just too bad. God's judgment to those who have been persecuted is actually the best news in the world because there's a God who is going to set things right. So that's the reason why the Creed says the living and the dead. It's because we experience judgment in very different ways, but I want to end with talking about how God judges us, because that's what ultimately matters. And that we have a judge who is a wounded healer and not a judge who judges us from a distance. In chapter 5 of the Gospel of John, verse 22, it says this, "For the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son." Why does that matter? One of the things that I think is important for you and I to remember is that the one who judges us is the one who's been judged. You know, Jesus never did anything wrong. At least no one could find anything that he'd done anything wrong. There were people that got up one day in like a court and tried to lie about him, to say things about him. Jesus personally was judged by all the Pharisees, every town he goes to. In fact, I challenged you one time to read a gospel and look at it. Jesus walked around and rarely judged anyone. But every city and town he walked in, everyone was watching him. Was he doing a good job or a bad job? Did he say a true thing or an untrue thing? I don't like how he did this. People grumbled at this. And everywhere he went, Jesus was literally the most judged person that had ever walked the face of this earth, and simultaneously the most innocent person that had ever walked the face of this earth. In fact, the last days of his life, he was sat in front of a human judge who judged him to be guilty. And as we get closer to Easter here in just a few moments, what we're going to be talking about is how the judge of the universe allows himself to be judged by all the little judges in our world, and they judge him so harshly that they decide to kill him. Jesus knows about judgment. And so when he looks upon you and I, what does he do? How does he respond? Well, I'll just end with this story. I was about 2 years ago or so, I was doing this thing that, Kelsey, Jonathan, and I have to do called continuing education. We're supposed to get smarter all the time. It's really hard for me, but I try. And so we go and learn things. And one of the things that I decided to do was sign up for a thing called spiritual direction. I'd never done it before. It's kind of trendy. But it's the idea that you go and meet with a spiritual director who's going to listen to you. And I signed up for it, and I'm like, oh man, this is not what I want to do. What do? Just go talk about my feelings and how I do stuff, And I'm like, oh, well, I guess I'll try it. So I did it. And I met with a guy named Dave. And I've met with Dave many times since. And the way it worked was I talked to Dave, and Dave says, well, how are you? How do you think I responded to that? Well, I had my crisp mask on, and I didn't want him to know what I was really struggling with. So I really just kind of said vague statements like, well, I'm doing good, I love God, but I wish, I experienced him a little bit more in my life and that kind of thing. And every time I would kind of say something that wasn't going well with my life or something where I was judging myself or felt judgment, he did something that I never expected would happen. Because usually when you tell someone what's wrong with you, what happens? Is you get a performance review. You get a judgment, right? And instead what he would do is I'd say, Dave, I'm not feeling that close to God right now, or I'm dealing with something in my life that I don't like. And what he would do is, because he's a great spiritual director, is he would say something like, well, first off, he doesn't say very much. But he would say, oh, that must be. And he would just acknowledge what I was going through and echo it back to me and listen. One of the sad realities is that most young people nowadays, you know what they use ChatGPT for, and AI? You think it's for their homework, but it's really not. They will sometimes. But the number one thing that most people are researching on AI is they're asking the AI how to deal with some of their problems. Why? It's because they feel like it's the one place they can actually go type something in and get advice and won't be judged. In fact, they've actually trained AIs, I don't know if you know this, that when you go and I tested this last night, if you go in and say you're dealing with a problem, the first thing it does? It says, oh, that must be really hard. They've trained the AI to show empathy because they know that's what we really need. And then in a non-judgmental way, it just offers some help. It's a sad world when people have lost sight of what the church and Jesus are, which is the one place that you should and could and always come to never be judged. To never be judged. What a sad world that people identify Christianity with the Pharisees now, where we think that this is what happens. You're just not good enough, or you're not holy enough, or you don't dress the right way, or you're not acting right enough, or you don't come to church enough, or you don't give enough, and all those things. But God looks at us in a very different way. Instead, when he sees people that are broken and hurting, and when he holds up a mirror to them, they see a reality they don't want to see. What does Jesus do? He comes down from heaven, and he comes down from a judgment seat. And he says, there probably should be some justice for this injustice that you've caused. And what he does is he says, instead of the judgment that should be put on you, I'm going to take that off your shoulders and that weight you cannot bear, and I'm going to carry that to a cross and die for you because I love you. There's a big difference between a Yelp review, where you're just telling someone they're doing a bad job, and when Jesus comes to you and says, be holy, but he doesn't say it as one who's indifferent to you. He says it as one who's experienced judgment and knows how painful that can be. And he does it so that you can know how much he loves you. I want you to know that the God of the universe judges you and finds you not guilty. Well, he finds you guilty, but all the guilt that you apply to yourself and that ought to be applied to you, he loves you so much that he takes that away from you. Adam and Eve, when they found themselves guilty before God in the garden when they first sinned, what was their first instinct? It was to hide, to cover themselves up with leaves, right? Because they didn't want anyone to see them. And what God does when he sees his children ashamed and hiding is he says, I'm so sorry you feel that way. I know what it's like to be judged. But I tell you what, here's all my righteousness and all of my love and all of my warmth and all of my grace. I put it on you like a robe. And for the rest of your life, you no longer have to walk around feeling judged because the God of the universe, who's the only one that can judge, has judged you worthy of grace. So the good news of the gospel, my friends, is that when we bless people here and we go to church, I hope to God that it's not a place where people experience judgment, but instead it's a place where you can walk in and know that the God of the universe doesn't look down with a scorn, but instead smiles upon you with love. Because that truly is the heart of God we find in Jesus Christ. Will you bow your heads and pray with me? Lord, thank you for the way that you show us grace. Thank you for the way that you forgive us, even though we deserve judgment. And thank you for the way that you took all the judgment we deserve and put it upon yourself so that we could be set free. And we pray this prayer, remembering the prayer you taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive those who sin against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.